Welcome to video number 2 for Chapter 34, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Shadow of War. Congress legislated neutrality in the period before World War II. The 1934 Nye Committee was formed to investigate whether or not munitions manufacturers were pro-war, existing for the sole purpose of making more money and more profits. The press blamed such producers for dragging America into the First World War, and they did not want to allow that to happen again in the case of the Second World War. To prevent America from being sucked into war, Congress passed the Neutrality Acts in 1935 and again in 1937, which stated that when a president proclaimed the existence of a foreign war, certain restrictions would automatically go into effect to prevent America's involvement. Some of those restrictions were that no American could legally sail on a belligerent ship, or sell or transport munitions to a belligerent, or make loans to a belligerent nation. This statutory neutrality benefited the dictators. The flaw with these acts was that they were designed to prevent America from being pulled into a war like World War I, but World War II would prove to be a very different situation. During the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, Spanish rebels, led by the fascist General Francisco Franco, rose up against the leftist-leaning Republican government. In order to stay out of the war, the U.S. put an embargo on both the Loyalist government, which was supported by Russia, the Soviet Union, and the rebels, which were aided by Hitler and Mussolini. During the Civil War, the U.S. simply stood by while Franco smothered the democratic government. America also failed to build up its fleet, since most people believed that huge fleets led to huge wars. Some Americans did volunteer to fight for the struggling Republic of Spain, and they were called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. In 1937, Japan essentially invaded China, but FDR didn't call this combat a war, thus allowing the Chinese to still continue to get arms and munitions from the United States. In Chicago of that year, he merely verbally chastised the aggressors, calling for a quarantine of Japan, through economic embargoes, perhaps. This was his famous quarantine speech. This quarantine speech asked for America to stay neutral, but to morally side against the fascist nations. This speech angered many isolationists, and FDR eventually backed down a bit from any more direct actions. In December of 1937, the Japanese bombed and sank the American gunboat the Panay, but then made the necessary apologies, saving America from entering the war. To vent their frustration, the Japanese resorted to humiliating white civilians in China through slappings and strippings. The Panay incident further supports America's determination to stay neutral. Meanwhile, Hitler was growing bolder and bolder after being allowed to introduce mandatory military service in Germany, take over the German Rhineland, persecute and exterminate about 6 million Jews, and occupy Austria, all because the European powers were appeasing him. They naively hoped that each conquest of Germany would be the last, and that was the result of the policy of appeasement. Convincing his people to sacrifice butter for guns, Hitler created the most powerful air force and mechanized ground force in the world. Hitler didn't stop, and at the September 1938 Munich conference, the Allies agreed to let Hitler have the Sudetenland of neighboring Czechoslovakia, again appeasing him, in hopes that he would become tired and stop. 6 months later, in 1939, Hitler pulled the last straw and took over all of Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to England and gave his infamous claim that he'd achieved peace in our time, and that may have been true, but it proved to be for a very short time. On August 23, 1939, the USSR shocked the world by signing a non-aggression treaty with Germany. Now it seemed that Germany could engulf all of Europe, especially without having to worry about fighting a two-front war in case Russia fought back. In essence, the non-aggression pact opened the door for Hitler to invade Poland. And that's just what he did. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and France and Britain finally declared war against Germany, but America refused to enter the war, its citizens still claiming that they did not want to be suckers again. Americans were anti-Hitler and anti-Nazi and wanted Britain and France to win, but they would not permit themselves to be dragged into fighting and bloodshed. The European powers needed American supplies, but the previous Neutrality Acts forbade the sale of arms to nations involved in war. So a new Neutrality Act of 1939 was passed, allowing European nations to buy war materials, but only on a cash-and-carry basis, which meant that Europeans had to provide their own ships and pay for their arms in cash. Since the British and French controlled the seas, the Germans couldn't buy arms from America, as it was intended. This is the works cited page. All of the images used in this presentation are from the public domain.